Okay, rather than covering anything new today, I want to give a little bit of a kind of hint session and do a little bit of example code for dealing with that last lab, the interprocess communication lab, dealing with connections. Based on the feedback I've gotten, there's been some confusion about that and some people having difficulty. So let me go through and give a little bit of feedback. So essentially, remember we needed to make a server and a client and two types of programs. Two clients will then connect to the server. And this picture is what we had from the last time. We have this server that has to listen for and accept two different connections from two different clients, and then it's going to send messages back and forth. The problem that people seem to be having is, how do you get two connections on one server? And that seems to have been causing some issues for some people. So what I'm going to do is quickly show some example code that does that, not doing this game specifically, but doing that kind of general concept of one server accepting multiple connections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to Python, and we're going to quickly throw together some example code that does that. So let me bring up a new shell here, and then I'll switch the screen over to it. So give me just a second to close some other things here. All right, so let me switch this over so you can see the desktop. Okay, so here's a Python kind of editor window. I'm just using idle right now. You could use PyCharm or whatever you want. But this is going to be, let's start off with the server, since that's where the confusion needs to, or seems to be. So again, the only thing we're going to need to import is multiprocessing. And in our case, we're going to want to use connection. So that's what we're going to use to communicate between these two things. And I'm going to go and set up the address. And I'm going to stick that into a tuple. And that tuple is going to consist of, I'm going to put the local host here, so 127.0.0.1. And then on the other end, I'm just going to pick a port. And last time, I think in the example code, I did 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll just go ahead and continue and use that port again. So remember, this is the server. It's going to open port 1, 2, 3, 4 on the local host and accept connections from other processes that are then going to connect on that port 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, what we need to do on this end is now essentially set up a listener. So we only really need one listener, because that one listener is going to handle both clients. So to set up the listener, we'll say listener equal multiprocessing.connection. Now, inside of there, we want to use a listener class, the listener, to create a listener object instance. So we call listener. And the thing we pass to that is the address, which we could have just hard-coded that in here. But here I'm just going to put address. And we also need, if we have an authentication key, we need to provide that. So in this case, I'm going to make up my authentication key. I'll just do secret password, whatever we want to call that. And that can really be whatever we want for our game. It could be some kind of generated string that's complicated, or it could be something like the name of the game. But the main purpose of that is so that you don't have stray things connecting to the listener and messing up your application. So it allows us to have this authentication added into that. Now, after that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this really simple. I'm going to make this kind of like a game loop that's going to accept multiple connections over and over again. But in order for this to work, we need to have two connections. So I'm going to do a print statement here and say print for connection. This is going to be waiting for connection 1. So I'm going to go and put a print statement for that. And let me put a ... to show this is waiting. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and accept a connection. So here, I'll even call it connection 1. And I'll say listener, which is the kind of class, a listener instance that we created up here. It's a listener object. And here what we want to do to accept that connection is accept. So the only way that this is going to accept a connection, if some client connects to this, and passes us the right password in. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and print out that we're connected. And I'll do that kind of like we did last time. I'll say connection accepted. And let me actually print out who it's from too. I guess it doesn't really matter, but we could print this out here. And if we wanted to, that listener has listener.last accepted. And that's going to give us the address of whoever the last one that was accepted was. In other words, this connection that we connected to was accepted. That's going to be the last one that's accepted, so we're just going to print that out. All right, so that's one connection. So now let's accept a second connection before we can actually do anything. So here we'd say waiting for connection 2. And I'm going to change this variable to connection 2. And then this code is going to be the same. So at this point, we are now connected to the other end. And so let's say if this were a game server thing, maybe we would send out some data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send a message to each of them saying whether they're player 1 or player 2. So this is going to be super simple. So in other words, connection1.send. And then what I'm going to send is just a string here. I'm going to say you are player 1. So we're sending that to player 1. And let me change this just a little bit. Let me do that. And then on connection 2. Now in your game, what you could do is send the board state to that player and then wait for them to make a move. And then we could go on and send the board state to player 2, wait for them to make a move, check to see if anyone won after each of those moves were made, and then put that in a loop where we're just sending, receiving, and so forth. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to send out these two messages. So on connection 2, I'm going to send you are player 2. And here, to make this a little more like the thing, I'm going to say player 1 is X, player 2 is going to be O. Okay, so we're sending out these messages, one to each of them. And then after that, we could have a loop around this that sends and then receives and sends and receives and so forth. But I'm just going to go and close this connection. So connection1.close, connection2.close. All right, so there's our program for our server. And that's using 2 connections with 1 listener. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and do a save as here. So file, save as. And let me make a new folder for this. Let me save it in here. I'm just going to call this server.py. Let me call it connection server. All right, so we saved that off. Now, I'm going to keep this on the screen here, and I'm going to do a file new. And now we're going to make the client. So I'll move that over here kind of to this side of the screen. So we can still see the server code. But now let's work on the client code. So client. And in the client code, what we're going to do is just be the other end of this connection. In other words, we're still going to, and to make things a little faster, here I'm just going to copy these 2 lines from over here, over there. So we're still using multiprocessing.connection. We're still using that same address. But now what we're ready to do is actually go ahead and make the connection. So we don't need to have a listener on this side. We just need to make the connection. So here, connection. There's only 1, so I'm not going to call them 1 or 2. I'm just going to call it connection. Here, it's going to be multiprocessing dot connection dot, and in this case it's not going to be a listener, it's going to be a client. So there's client, And what do we pass to client? We pass on the address, which is the same address that we're connecting to that they're listening on. And we're also going to pass in that same password. I forgot what I called it, so we'll just copy it from over here. Secret password. So we put that there. All right, so now we have our connection that now has been made. So if we get here, so let's go and print here. Let's put a print statement in front of this. So print connecting. And then after this, let's do a print connected to, and we know what we're connected to. It's the address that we specified up there at the top. So at that point, we're connected. And now at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to wait for data to come to us, because over here, the server is going to send. We need to receive. So I'm going to put another print statement here and say print waiting for data. I'll put a ... to show that that's going to wait a little bit. And now what I have to do is do a receive. So here I'm going to say message equal, let's do connection dot receive. So that's going to get the message that comes out of this send. So this is what we're going to get. That's going to go into message. And remember, with the connection objects, we don't have to worry about did we get all of it or not, because as soon as this returns, we know we got one whole message that was transmitted to us. So now I'm just going to print out what the message was. So message received, message. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and have them press enter to exit. We could just close the thing, but I want to run this in kind of its own window. And so we're going to want to see that, what it says. So I'm going to go ahead and do an input. We'll just say enter to exit. And then after that, I'm going to do a print. We'll just say closing connection. And then here we'll do connection.close. And now we're all done. Do a print done, I suppose, at the end. All right, so now we have our server, we have our client, but notice that for the client to get to the point where it sends, it has to have two clients connect to it. So the server will accept one, it'll say that it was accepted, it'll wait for the next one, it'll accept the second one, and then at that point the game can begin. In this case, the game is just sending them each a message saying whether they're player 1 or 2, and then continuing from there. So let's go ahead and try this. So I'm going to come over to the server, I'm going to run it first. And now let me kind of shrink this window down so we can see all this at one time. So they're just waiting for connection 1. I'm going to make this a little smaller this way. Now, to test this, let me go ahead and go to where we saved the program. Oh, we never saved the client. Let's save that. Connection client.py, save. All right, so we've saved that. So now we're ready to run that client. So notice the server is just patiently waiting there. So let's run a client. And actually, I must have typed something wrong. Let me open that real quick and then run it from here. Oh, I cut and pasted and had 2 commas. So let's fix that. So it won't even run. So Control S, let's try again. All right, so the server, I believe, is still patiently waiting. So let's run the client. So there's client, that one ran. Notice that it said connection was accepted. Now it's waiting for connection 2. So I'm going to leave this one over here. And remember, this one should get the message saying it's player 1 because it was the first one to connect. Let's run another instance of that client. And there's the second one. And now notice as soon as the second one, the first one got player 1, you are X. The second one got you are player 2, you are O. And at this point, the connection hasn't been closed, so we could have that in a loop that goes back and does more stuff with it and more stuff with it. Makes again. But notice over here on the server, all it did is after the connections, it sent the messages and it closed them and went back to the top. So those connections are actually closed right now on the server side. In your game, you're going to need to have a loop inside the game that continues while the game progresses and handles the game logic. But this is essentially what you want to do for that thing. So if I hit enter here, that one closes. Hit enter here, that closes. And notice the game server is back to waiting for a connection. So I could actually, once the server's up and running, it could have client connect. Next client connects. One is player one, one is player two. The game continues. Once it's done, the server can go back and wait for more people to log in to play the game. So that's essentially the idea. And let me go back to that code here for a second. Here's the server. One listener, accept, do stuff with the connection, send, receive, send, receive, send, receive, and we're done. Close the connections. And the client, basically just connects. Once it's successfully connected, send, receive, send, receive, send, receive, however much needs to be done. And when it's done, it closes the connection. So hopefully that helps out some with what you need to do for the lab. That's all we're going to do today. So if you do have other questions, make sure to let me know. But the idea is server, client, and if you follow that method that we just did there in that example code, that should be essentially what you need for the game. The part that you're going to have to figure out is how to send the game state and the command state back and forth between the two with sends and receives. And again, you might want to map that out ahead of time, draw a little picture of who sends what, what does the user do, what's responsive. You might want to make like a little flow chart that will help you with that. But the idea is pretty straightforward as far as getting connected. After that, the work is going to be in the connection objects. And one of the things that I would suggest is, since that the cool thing about those connection objects is you can pass objects through. If you were to just stick the data into like a dictionary, for example, you can easily just send the entire dictionary across to there. And you could have one that's like the game state key value that's in the dictionary. You could have one that's like the information command string or whatever you want to call it that's in the dictionary. And you could send those two things kind of back and forth between those by just sending the dictionary all in one shot. All right, so hopefully that helps. Work on your lab. Let me know if you have any questions, and we should be hopefully you should be on the road to finishing that. We're not going to cover anything else today. So work on that lab, get that done by next week. And next week we're going to change gears a little bit and try some other things. We've got some weeks left in the semester to learn a few more things, so we're going to get a few more things under our belt that will be really useful for your use of concurrency. And I do want to get at some point to covering some of this in a language other than Python. And really, the concepts are very similar in other languages for what we're covering here. Everything from kind of the problems that you have with concurrency to controlling it with synchronization objects or inter-process communication. Those things are all really kind of the same concepts, but there's a little bit different syntax and methodology or way you approach it in some of those other languages. So I want to get to that by the end of the semester. All right, we'll stop there. Everybody stay safe. Hope everybody's doing okay. Send me email, post questions in the comments. I'm happy to help. Send me a text message, however you need to talk to me. Make sure to ask questions if you have them, and I'm here to help. Also, you can send me things on Discord. All right, thanks.